Hi, Aaliyah. Please, you.
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm going to answer your question in two parts. And the first is really going to deal with the kind of latter point that you mentioned about South Africa and essentially the onslaught it is faced by the Trump administration. And when I say onslaught, I really do mean a deliberate campaign of misinformation and disinformation that the Trump administration has lodged against South Africa
Mhm.
and its, alleged human rights abuses towards a particular minority, white Afrikaner people in South Africa, and the quote unquote white genocide that Trump has kind of labeled as what's happening in South Africa. Now, when we talk about this issue, I must emphasize that South Africa is the first country in recent memory that has faced this level of a campaign of disinformation and misinformation from a power as big as the United States, directly from the head of its administration, President Donald Trump. And I think the way that South Africa, diplomatically has dealt with it deserves a kind of moment of explanation. That is to say that we've taken a very hard line stance in the sense of consistently proving factually that these claims are that it is indeed misinformation and disinformation that is being lodged, that these claims are actually falsified, whether through kind of false media or false allegations sprayed within and outside of South Africa's borders. But number two, we very diplomatically said, please, our borders are open. Should you want to witness any kind of witness the reality on the ground, please do so. We've consistently kept the doors open for cooperation, for communication, and with trust building with the Trump administration, and unapologetically so. And I think it's very important to emphasize this as not only a diplomatic kind of reaction from the South African government, but a specific platform on which the South African G20 presidency has moved from. And that brings me to my second point, which is to say that the G20 fundamentally, while it has no, and I'm sure it's a repeated kind of criticism of the platform, that it has no kind of record of enforceable timelines, and its declarations and decisions are not by any means legally binding. So what that means is that the G20 is essentially a connective tissue for countries to come together, to cooperate, to collaborate on collective problem solving with issues from, as fellow panelists mentioned, from climate resilience and climate kind of disaster prevention mechanisms to debt sustainability and restructuring. That is to say that the spirit of that cooperation, of that collaboration, of coming together is by no means being threatened by, for example, the US's boycott or its deliberate efforts to not only undermine the G20, but the very principles that South Africa kind of rooted its presidency in. So sustainability, solidarity, and equality, emphasis on solidarity when we're talking about cooperation. And I think that, as Professor Jagdish really emphasized, is that no other kind of partner or ally of both South Africa or the US kind of took a step back, because the world, whether you're a developed country or a developing country, everybody knows that based off of the Trump administration's first term as well as its current term, there are very material consequences and ramifications should you go against the kind of Trump administration's narrative. But as I mentioned, Professor Jagdish really emphasized the fact that no ally of either South Africa or the US kind of backed off. In fact, very little airtime really, in whether it's tweets or diplomatic statements from heads of states to embassy officials and diplomats. Little airtime was given to addressing the kind of claims that the Trump presidency was making, which in and of itself proves that not only are these claims not worth the time, of the senior most diplomatic officials of countries, but second of all, that the credibility and legitimacy of a platform like the G20 was of utmost importance in order to continue respecting, in order to continue for work the work of the past year, and not only the past year, but really the past 2 decades or decade rather of the G20 really being a notable platform, to be respected and to be continued, whether even if it is in this moment.
Yeah.
I will say, just to close, is that I'm sure my fellow panelists have also considered the kind of very real threat and risk of the G20 being hollowed out under the presidency of the United States, which is not at all kind of premature. It's a very real threat and risk, given that senior diplomatic officials in Washington have said that the Trump administration's intentions for its G20 presidency are to really go back to the basics, and I quote that. Do we know what that really means? No, because the US has not yet kind of released any kind of agenda or even thematic focus for its G20 presidency. But I will, very boldly be so bold as to say that should the initiatives that were launched during South Africa's G20 presidency, for example, the African Engagement Framework, or any G20 presidency, under the likes of India, Brazil, Indonesia, and Malaysia, should that work stop for the fact of the Trump presidency not giving it any kind of airtime or legitimacy or credibility to continue under its watch? It will be an act of kind of institutional vandalism, for lack of better phrasing. It will be quite detrimental to the middle and emerging powers that really rely on forums like the G20 to kind of stage certain issues like debt restructuring, which greatly affect the developing world. Those countries simply rely on platforms like the G20 and others to not only spotlight those issues, but to make real progress on kind of fleshing out what those topics are, what kind of debt restructuring really means in the grander sense when we're talking about responsibilities for not only developing countries who have to approach the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, but for broader powers like European powers as well. I will say that more proactively, and this is my final point, is that should, as we saw over the last week or two, we've seen that President Donald Trump has tried to actively disinvite South Africa from a future G20 forum next year in Miami, Florida. Number one, it's important to realize that as my fellow panelists acknowledged, South Africa is a founding member, so there's no kind of legal precedent to disinvite a country. There's no real we can't even say that there's a language of invitations. As a founding member, you have a binding right to be there. Okay. So should South Africa for whatever reason not kind of be barred from participation in G20 activities beyond the summit, that's kind of another very real possibility. But my point is that proactively, I believe that South Africa should be thinking long term and consider the following G20 presidency, that's 2027, which will be held by the United Kingdom, which it has had historically good relations with, and consistently is the UK's strongest trading partner in Africa. And that's not only South Africa. As much as the conversation has thus far focused on South Africa and its success, it is kind of a vote of caution to my fellow panelists and other developing and developed nations, is to kind of look in the long term and not kind of respond reactively, but rather proactively. Because we've seen under Keir Starmer's presidency, they're far more open to what multilateralism means and kind of playing by the rules, so to speak, of existing multilateral and global governance institutions. So that's just a kind of proactive strategy going forward.
I will stay with you, Aaliyah. From what you have said, we will want to understand the status quo of global leadership at this juncture, taking the case study of probably the diplomatic rift that we saw, the whole world saw, between South Africa and the United States of America, threatening the G20 summit. What can we say is the status quo of this global leadership in terms of the new perspectives of shifting alliances, new alliances, or new engagement with global South, global North, and other emerging powers?
think, it is no secret that South Africa and the US diplomatic relations have consistently been strained over the past at least a year now. Strained in a way where it wasn't, one particular event, one particular kind of post on Truth Social. It's been a consistent kind of barrage of criticism, of discrediting, in a lot of ways, if I may be so bold as to say, humiliation of South Africa, of its, whether it's government or, even its work on the G20. So as much as I mentioned, South Africa's kind of diplomatic strategy has been to counter these claims with facts, as well as to kind of keep the door open for communication. It can't be denied that our not only our diplomatic ties, but have been kind of really strained, but this has also kind of filtered into very real material consequences for our trade ties with the USA. And that's, most evident in, for example, suffering of our local citrus industry, which has really affected employment levels, to trade, to, a very big strain on that particular industry, and others. I will say that as much as South Africa, and it's, before I end that point, sorry, that has also seeped into kind of regional relations. We've got the AGOA agreement, which, by all means was not looking like it was going to be renewed by any means, simply because of the US's kind of, not only its poor view of South Africa, but its poor view of development finance and development cooperation in general. And again, I reiterate that it is the Trump administration's very inward-looking gaze that we're really seeing have very material consequences for not only its kind of target countries like South Africa, but entire regions, that depend on certain agreements or ties for economic benefit. When we're talking about, what this kind of means for kind of shifting alliances or kind of the survival of various nations, both South Africa included, I think this is where, and maybe my fellow panelist, Dr. Enrique, can really hone in on this point, is we're really starting to see a kind of emphasis on diversified partnerships. And this has really come out strongly for South Africa from the European Union, that have, from a European Union level to European Union members individually, like the UK, like France, like Germany, come out in favor of kind of strengthening existing diplomatic and economic ties with South Africa. This was, of course, reiterated at the 7th African Union and European Union annual summit that happened not too long ago. Again, a real emphasis on diversified partnerships that go beyond, simply diplomatic kind of handshakes, but really, how do countries kind of diversify their economic streams, so to speak, or their trade relations, and how does this and how does that kind of not only mitigate the kind of gap, I would say, or the kind of vacuum that the US has left in a lot of developing countries, including South Africa, but more so to make to kind of bolster individual countries' capacity to withstand things like conflict, like, for example, many African countries were greatly negatively affected by the Russia-Ukraine war, given that Ukraine is a really big provider of grain to many developing countries. So how do, it's not only diversified partnerships to offset, a Truth Social post from the Trump administration, but generally when we've got several conflicts from that which is occurring in Sudan to Ukraine to Gaza in Palestine, how do we offset any kind of diplomatic as well as kind of material consequences of that through diversified partnerships?